Welcome to OzCast, the platform where we take a deep dive into the science and research behind the issues impacting Australian waterways. Each week, we team up with experts in their field to take a look below the surface. Craig, welcome to OzCast.
Thanks, Jono. Happy to be here, mate. What a great concept.
It's a good concept. I must admit, it probably was inspired off a talk that I heard you give here in Newcastle. We're based in Newcastle today. The Fishers for Fish Habitat Forum is the name given to it. And you got up on stage. I think it might have been one of your counterparts, Tom Rayner, who was helping you with that one. And then you delivered a similar talk down in Melbourne for the World Wreck Fishing Conference. And both times, your 15-minute window that you get at those conferences, I left thinking, I want to chat further about what Craig has to say, because I think the topic we're going to talk about today, which is fish screens and fish screening technology and irrigation and the issue with pumps, is slept on, particularly in the industry. And what I mean by that is not enough people know about it.
Yeah, well, look, it's not unlike a lot of issues when it comes to rivers. It's unseen. Look, I never take it for granted just how lucky I am as a researcher to get to see, like you guys say, beneath the surface, to see into that unseen world and see it for all its beauty, its diversity. Our fresh waters are some of the most diverse habitats around, but they're also, under the pump. There's a lot going wrong with them, and I think to be able to speak to the average person, to the politician, to the policy maker about the good and the bad, the warts and all, I think is a really important thing to do.
Would you say that, let's just touch on that for a second, those slept on issues, those ones that aren't in the public eye, would you say that fish screens is one of the ones that, and we're going to get to the ins and outs and what they are very shortly, but would you say that's one that you reckon is probably most hidden, most concealed, purely due to the fact that if you live on the coast, Newcastle, well, you're a long way away from probably the nearest screener or the nearest pump. Is that one of the ones that you reckon needs a little bit more attention?
Yeah, it's really the sleeping giant of river restoration. Look, you only have to go back 10 years ago, and no one was even talking about the losses of fish at water diversions as one of the key threats to native fish. So that's starting to change now. But look, and it's hard to see. And you speak to people out there, even that operate water diversions, and you can't see below the surface. So you don't really understand that full impact.
So let's for someone listening, maybe in the car on the drive home or something like that, they might be going, "What are you talking about?" So this can give a brief summary of the issue. In short, you've got fish in our inland rivers that happen to be coexisting alongside pumps for irrigation and agriculture, and unfortunately, they just don't. Previously, because of the design of the ladder, they haven't worked, and you're getting fish pumped up through the pumps, and unfortunately either being killed, cut in half, or ending a long way up into the maybe the crops or wherever that water is going. Is that right?
Yeah. So there's no getting around it. We divert a lot of water out of our rivers. We divert it for town water supply. We divert predominantly most of it for irrigation and agriculture. Look, they say around 80% is a good sort of figure to run with. So that's a large proportion of the water that's flowing down rivers that gets diverted out. Look at some of the diversions, it's even a lot higher. Like, it's not unheard of in some of those large gravity-fed diversions down the southern basin to get 70 up to 90% of the flow that's flowing down a river goes out onto the onto paddocks and onto dams and storages. So with that water, obviously goes fish and debris. And everything that's in the river, aquatic life goes with it.
Right. So it's one of those ones that, again, you would talk about being, concealed from the public eye. You would never know what's happening. The only people that would have first understood this issue would have been potentially the ones that are seeing dead fish in their canals, above the pumps. Is that right?
Yeah, look, the funny thing is, though, we went back and we looked through there's a fantastic resource at the National Library called Trove. It allows you to go through it's great, isn't it? It allows you to go through a lot of the old newspaper articles. You can do a search. So, a couple of years back, me and a few colleagues wanted to do basically get the evidence together on how many fish may we be losing? So we looked at both the contemporary evidence that's collected by scientists, but we went through Trove and we had a look at some of those reports, and it goes back to the 1940s. So there's articles going back where it was acknowledged. TC Ruffley, the head of fisheries, actually went down to the Murray and the Bidgie to meet with farmers and to meet with fishers because they had a huge issue because they had millions of cod that were dying in irrigation systems. They were talking about how do they solve this problem. They were suggesting things like, well, how about we use these irrigation canals as hatcheries to restock the rivers? That's how many fish there were in there.
So that was being reported in newspapers and the media back then?
Yep. Like over 60 close to 80 years ago.
Wow.
Yep. So we have known about the problem for a long time. I suppose what we haven't had until recently is a viable solution for it.
But yeah, we'll get to solutions shortly. It's interesting because in the bit of reading that I did, there's been solutions around in other countries for a long, long time. So, the more I do these podcasts, the more I come to the realisation that Australia is just not a great example at the moment in terms of probably being behind the eight ball a little bit. You might have something to say on that because I'll give you an example. I was speaking to Martin Malin Cooper in episode 1. We were talking about flow and weirs, and he was saying that he's been working over in Cambodia for a long, long time. But their history with river management and being civilised is 3,000 years nearly. In Australia, we're 250 years. We've created more damage in 250 years than they have in 3,000 years. And I just had to ask, like, how have we done that? It's such a short period of time.
Yep.
And I guess if you say, well, if we've had solutions in other parts of the world for a long time, we've only really implemented it, in the last 10 years? When was the first time we really came across the solution?
Yeah, so I suppose, to be fair, we do some really good things here in Australia.
Yeah.
So, like, fishways is a classic example. We build fishways probably better than anywhere in the world.
Really?
That's recognised. Like, because of the work of people like Martin Malin Cooper, who you've had previously on your podcast, we design fishways that pass a larger range and size class and a variety of species than anywhere in the world.
Is that just because of how big Australia is too and the different terrain that we're dealing with?
I think it's the realistic thing we have to come to grips with is that we have many species that want to move upstream, downstream, throughout a river system. So we need to accommodate that.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, while we do really well in some respects, there's other areas where we need to improve on. And fish screens is a classic example because it's a solution that's been worked on and been refined and improved for over 100 years in countries like the United States, like a century.
Yeah.
Even our mates across the ditch in New Zealand have been doing it for a couple of decades.
Right.
So the beauty for us, though, is that, if we're going to apply that, we can apply best practice as it applies now. We don't have to make the same mistakes, and they've made many over the years when we come to designing our fish screening programs.
Excellent. No, I'm really excited about this conversation today. So let's take a step back. Let's give the people listening at home a bit of insight into, I guess, who you are and how. Where were you born?
Sydney boy.
A boy from Sydney ended
Eastern
up
suburbs.
Yeah, and then you're now in Newcastle. You did a lot of work in Port Stephens, and then how you become working. You seem to be one of the leading names. I know you'll be modest and won't want to agree with that, but one of the leading names in this space for sure. But a lot of the work is done in our inland rivers. So I'm really interested to hear how you've come to that point. So Sydney University, was it, or
no? Uni in New South Wales.
Right.
Yep. Look, when I started out at university, my dream was to be a vet. I loved animals. I just had that sort of affinity for it, and did pretty well at high school, but just not well enough at the time to get the marks to get into veterinary science. So I started a biological science degree, and after a couple of years, turns out that I wasn't going to get into veterinary science, but I took up. I loved research, I suppose. I had an inquisitive mind, so I took on an honours project and actually worked on red kangaroos. Looking at their salivary glands, which is just a fancy way of saying I kept 5 kangaroos and used to feed them drugs and collect their dribble. Really,
we love detours on this podcast just on kangaroos. I've recently heard that whilst they are, they're on our coins and they're, on the coat of arms and things like that, that they're starting to become a little bit of a pest by way of how many there are and how they've adapted to, what we're doing here in Australia with just clearing land. Any opinion on that?
Yeah, look, they're a great evolutionary example of a successful species. I suppose they've adapted really well to our boom and bust climate. So when the conditions are good, they can breed really fast. So they can have, a joey in pouch. They can have a joey developing, but they can also have, fertilised embryos also developing. So they can have like 3 generations on the go at the same time. They can pair that back when the conditions get tough. So, they're survivors. And they're, I remember when I was at university, they were looking at, can we farm them? How can we farm them? Because, they're great eating. Let's be honest.
People do eat them.
Yeah, I eat them. I love them. But, how do you keep a kangaroo in a paddock when it's going to jump over the fence? So that was always, I think that was a simple thing they couldn't solve. So
classic. Yeah, no, sorry, I detoured there. So you started working, interesting that you're not the first one that I've interviewed on this. You actually started working, on land. You weren't in the aquatic scene yet throughout your university time. How on earth did you make it below the surface, I guess?
Yeah. Look, I suppose I got to a point when I finished my honours where, like everyone does, you have to think as a postgrad, how am I going to earn money?
Yeah, how are you going to live?
Put money on the table. So I just thought there probably wasn't going to be money in cute furry mammals. So I thought, how could I apply my aptitude and interest in physiology to a career? And I thought, a good way I might be able to do that is through working in the aquaculture research industry. So I put in for some voluntary work at Port Stephens, and whilst I was waiting for that, I had a friend I went to university with, Cameron Lay. He's now a director at fisheries. And he said, do you want to come on a field trip? We've got this young guy doing his PhD, Lee Baumgartner, which I don't know, have you heard of Lee?
Oh, absolutely. So, he's been put forward as the name to interview on the recent fish kills. Yeah, so a fantastic guy,
director down at Charles Sturt University now. He was formerly at fisheries, but I remember going on one of his trips, and they didn't pay me, but they paid me in beer and hamburgers, and which is always good at that age. But I remember looking at Lee and just, I was just sort of in awe of his ability to back an electro-fishing boat in the water. And being on those trips and, I was in my budgie smugglers, climbing through fishways, sampling fish, taking water measure. Yep. Yeah, that's right. And I thought, hey, this is pretty good. Maybe there's a career in this. And that sort of led me to take a PhD with fisheries in fish ecology.
Right. So it was, you could probably thank one good weekend on beer and hamburgers to all the good work you've done ever since.
It ended up costing them more than paying me a wage. I could eat and drink back then.
So then I guess you did mention off air that you had an underlying interest you had a few underlying interests there, which happen, to now align with what you're doing, which is kind of cool. I think it's always interesting when you've got an interest early on and then you eventually make a career out of it. And you said you had an interest in engineering, infrastructure, and then how that can work with, the animals that you might focus on, which in your case ended up being fish. Was that always there? Was there always that kind of passion underneath?
Yeah, well, I suppose the ecology side of things wasn't, I wasn't as interested in pure ecology as I was physiology. So that physiology angle really took me into the areas of experimental biology as well. So, running manipulative experiments on animals to see how they react to different situations. So I suppose it's been a natural progression for me to move from what was, when I did my PhD, pure ecology, looking at fish habitat use out in dryland rivers, to now where I am, where it's looking at how we can innovate and improve on the way we design and operate river infrastructure, so to benefit fish.
River infrastructure, it's a tongue twister. It's one that, to me, two words don't traditionally, work in the same sentence. You're talking about building in rivers. if you think about what a river should be in its natural state, there's no buildings, there's no infrastructure. So can we touch on that for a little bit? River infrastructure, what is it? What are some common examples of river infrastructure? And then also, what are the ones that have really kind of come a long way in the last, since you've been around, the last 2 decades?
Yep. So since Europeans settled in the country, we've done a lot to change our river system. So, we've introduced species that we brought over from Europe, redfin perch, trout, things like that. We've dammed our rivers to try control the flows, to deliver them when we need the flow, not when the flow traditionally used to happen. And that's mucked around with the ability of fish to spawn and survive and recruit, because they've evolved to receiving flows at particular points in time. We've changed habitats. We've pulled snags out of rivers. We've degraded riparian. What we've done is we've trained our rivers. We've put a heap of concrete and steel across our rivers to be able to capture flows and divert flows. Everything from big dams, so those big storages. We've put in low-level weirs, so these are those smaller structures. You've probably heard people talk about how we've turned some of our rivers into from a flowing habitat into a series of stepped sort of
I think Mark Linteman's described it as salamied our rivers.
Yeah. Exactly. So we put that in. We've and every time we've sort of put those weirs in to back water up, we've done that for a purpose, and that's to capture that water so we can then divert it to use in our towns or on our farms. And so there's plenty we've done. And really what we've done by as Linte talked about and salamied our rivers is we've stopped our fish being able to move naturally up and downstream. So, they want to move up. They hit their heads on these concrete and steel structures. They want to drift and swim back downstream, but they have to pass through undershot weirs or through hydropower turbines, and this munches them. It's not good for fish. We've done research to show that we lose a large proportion of our fish as they're trying to pass these structures. Yeah. And if they don't pass the structures, they're then sitting in a weir pool and really susceptible to being sucked out of the rivers.
So is the pumps considered a part of that infrastructure? That's another example.
Yeah, 100%. So we've got it's probably worth talking about the different main ways that we divert water from our rivers. Yep. So you'll hear me talk about pump diversions and gravity-fed diversions. So the main difference is, so you can imagine, and this predominantly happens in the northern Murray-Darling Basin, we've got these really large incised channel systems, and the flow of water typically is at base level, just at the bottom of that channel. So how do you get that water from the bottom of that channel up into a farm dam? Well, you put a pipe down into that water, connect a pump to the end of it and suck it out. Yep. So that's a pump diversion. Now, when you look at what's more common down in the southern basin, you've actually got these series of weirs that back the water up and lift that water level, create what's called a weir pool. Then you dig a channel out, and then the water just gravity feeds down those channels. And those channels have the ability to, like we mentioned earlier, divert quite a large proportion of the water really quickly out of those river channels.
Right. So, but in the case of the pumps, they're the issue, not the gravity fed ones. It's the pumps that are the problem.
No, both. In fact, pumps will have it will definitely suck fish out. Anyone who has a fish tank and they've got, you've got an inline filter will know that fish will find their way into that pump.
I think Nemo did at one point.
Or pulled up against the trash screen on that pump. But you also know that if you've got an overflow system where water spills over a weir and down into a sump, you also know that you'll lose a lot of fish. I remember I used to keep a system like that, and I had a whole ecosystem of fish living under my tank in the sump tank, just because they would basically follow the flow. Yeah. So you can imagine when our fish, they migrate upstream. Some of the species migrate upstream to spawn and breed, and then as babies, as eggs and larvae, they typically drift then downstream. They follow the flow. We've even got juveniles and adult fish that adopt the same behaviour. As they're moving downstream, if we're diverting 70, 80, 90% of the water at those gravity-fed diversions out of the river channel, which way are they going to go?
Yeah.
They just follow the flow.
70 of 80% of the larvae are going with it.
So that sort of destocking of rivers is actually greatest at those, or there's greater potential for it at those gravity-fed diversions than at the pumps.
Interesting. So that phrase, destocking of rivers, taking eggs or larvae or potential new fish out of the river as opposed to stocking, which is putting them in. Sounds like a very, basic concept, but we, particularly in the media, hear a lot about the stocking efforts. We're putting fish back in. But by these gravity-fed, we're actually taking them out.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and look, and I use that term destocking purely because it's something that people can relate to.
It paints a great picture.
So when we talk about the numbers of fish that we believe that we're losing, so look, if we look at New South Wales data alone, so, from pumps, there's about 4,500 of them across the state. We believe that based on some of the contemporary research we've been doing, that we're probably losing about 97 million fish per year from those pumps alone in New South Wales. There's studies that have been done down in the south of New South Wales on these large gravity-fed diversions, and when you look at species like golden perch, trout cod, Murray cod, the numbers that have been lost at that egg and larval stage, equate to about 40 per meg. So when you look at some of the data, there was a great study done by Gilligan and Schiller back in the late 90s, early 2000s, that where they estimated that you're looking at many million of those species being lost in any given sort of 3-month irrigation season at 5 main diversions on the Murray, so from Yarrawonga down to Turrumbary. But to put that into context, even if we are really conservative and say that most of those fish wouldn't survive anyway to juvenile fingerling stage, so if we look at what would survive, it equates to about 1.2 million fish we expect that in some of those years have been lost from those diversions. So in that stretch of river, in that 5 years preceding that study, that's the 1.2 million fish they lost was 1,000 times the stocking efforts in that reach. So they're tipping fish in and they're losing 1,000 times more than they had over 5 years. If you look at the northern, those pump examples, that 97 million figure I threw out there, to put that in the context with stocking. So I was actually flicking through Facebook the other day, and I yesterday I was having a look at our stocking figures at DPI over the last year alone and our targets, and we're looking at 2 million native fish of those species that we're stocking into our rivers. So that 97 million, that's 50 times more fish being removed every year than we're actually tipping in.
So we're tipping in 2 million, did you say? Around that?
Yeah, around 2 million. When you look at in the last 12 months, based on species like trout cod, Murray cod, silver perch and golden perch.
2 million. So for people listening at home, we talk about an issue being slept on. 2 million fish of rec fishing license money, trust money, that's where stocking comes from, doesn't it? Those efforts into the water, 2 million. And these pumps, through your research, are taking out 97 million.
And that's a conservative estimate as well. So with some of the contemporary research is obviously it's going to vary from pump to pump and place to place and season to season, year to year. But when you really look at it, the Queenslanders did a study and they found that 12,000 fish were taken in a 9-hour period at one small pump.
Let's say you were wrong by 20%. Let's say the research had a 20% deviation on it or something, and we're only lost 80 million, 70 million. You're still we're talking 10x.
Yeah. So that Queensland data is working on about 800 odd fish per meg that they found. We've used a conservative 3.5 fish a meg But, some studies are more, some studies are less. At the end of the day, some of the work that was done up on the Namoy, for instance, was about 200 fish a day. So if you look at that across, the 4,500 pumps, you can see the cumulative, the numbers add up. And look, and it's going to, we can sort of say, is it going to be less than 97 million? Is it going to be more? At the end of the day, it's not millions, it's tens of millions.
Yeah.
So it's based on the best evidence we've got now, it's clear that it's an issue that, like you said, we've been sleeping on it. We've been largely unaware of it.
My mind straight away goes to, well, if that many fish are getting sucked up, right? It's a terrible term, but they are. They're getting sucked up. Those fish are in the rivers, right? So to me, like, whilst we're losing all those fish, it is an indication that if we do something about it, there's a lot of fish in there, that can be saved. And those, imagine if we get those 97 million or whatever, and then they all go do their thing, do their funky business. There's a lot of fish still in that river. And if we can just do like what we're about to get onto, find a few solutions, there's, the future looks bright.
Yeah. So if you
look bright.
You look at the way that we used to do it. Actually, look at the way we still do it. From time to time, fisheries agencies will go out and they'll be asked to save fish in out of farm dams, irrigation systems. Actually, the first time, if you don't mind me sort of just moving on to a bit of a side story, but the first time that I sort of came across this issue was when I was doing my PhD, probably at the height of the Millennium Drought. It would have been about 2005. I think I was...
and for those who don't know, the Millennium Drought was 2001, was it, to 11?
It was basically through that, through those early... 2001 through to 11. That's pretty close.
Yeah.
Millennium Drought, because it was the worst drought in the millennium, basically.
Yep.
So
who named that? Weird.
Yeah. So I was out there doing my PhD, looking at fish habitat associations, where fish were living, and the way we're doing that with electrofishing boats. I was driving through Burke, and I had this electrofishing boat, and someone called me over and said, "Hey, can we borrow you for a day or two? We've got all these fish that are basically about to die because our storage is going to dry up for the first time in a decade." So we're no worries. So we put that boat in, and in a few hours we caught hundreds and hundreds of golden perch, cod, silver perch that we released in a farm dam. If you look at that, those rescues still happen today. So every year, if you get to the end of the irrigation season, if you're scrolling on Facebook, you'll see the Vic Fishing Authority will post about the hundreds of golden perch, Murray cod, blackfish that they pull out of those irrigation systems as they dewater it.
And the reason they're in there is because they've been...
That's right. So I suppose the point is, do we keep sort of putting a Band-Aid over a decapitation and try, bucket fish back into the river, or is there a better solution?
Yeah. Wow. So what year was that, roughly? So you said 2003 or 4, something like that?
Yeah, about 2000. I reckon it would have been about 2005.
Yeah. So let's start painting a bit of a timeline for everyone. So you said 60 years ago, let's say around the 1950s, just you said it was recorded from Trove Records in newspaper archives that there was an issue known around pumps and around fish being sucked up into these pumps. Fast forward, do you give me a rough date, if you can off the top of your head, as to when the first screen went into a river, roughly? What decade? Was it pre-2010, post-10?
We're probably talking the first fish-friendly screen was probably the Kahuna screens that went in 2017.
2017.
Yeah, 2017. And there was a great program called run by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority called the Native Fish Strategy. You probably heard about it. So it was a 50-year strategy to recover native fish. As part of that strategy, it funded some really great research and development activities. And one of the ones that it did fund was it funded some of the early work from scientists like Lee Baumgartner that was looking at the issue about fish losses on the back of that, they funded some research, just going, okay, we need some solutions here. So what can we do about it? And that's where I really got involved. So off the back of that being out there rescuing those fish, I had some sort of inkling understanding what the scale of the problem might be, but we really had no idea how to solve it. So we started doing a research project where it took us to other parts of the world to find out how we've talked about other parts of the world, like the United States, doing this for a century.
Wow.
So that was between 2009 and 2012 where we did that initial research and scoping, saw what they were doing over there and thought, hey, this might work over here. Let's come back.
Were you on those trips?
I sure was.
And what were your observations? What are they doing? What were they doing? And particularly, what were their problems? Is it the same problem they're facing?
Yeah, same but slightly different. So the reason why they've been addressing the issue for a century is because they've got quite strict legislation and threatened species protection laws over there, and it's all really geared around protecting their salmon. So they've got if you know that part of the world, so I'm talking about the Pacific Northwest of the United States, Oregon, Washington, California. They have mass migrations of salmon up the river. They go up and they spawn.
Right.
Those fingerlings, right on cue, in their thousands and millions, will move downstream through their river systems. Now, they've got big issues because they've got a lot of hydropower dams. And when those fingerlings hit those hydropower dams, a lot of them get munched by the turbines. So they're dealing with, they have juvenile fish bypasses. They put them in trucks. They move them downstream and release them just so they can stop that species from going extinct. Another big issue they've got, though, is as they're moving down, they follow the flow, like we talked about, and they're going out into these irrigation systems. So they needed to solve that because there was a huge source of mortality for their fish. So that's why they've basically been screening. It was legislated a long time ago for them to if your diversion is over a certain size, you need to put a screen on. So they've been working on screening for close to a century now.
Well, I'm always interested in how we can learn from other countries. How we can take what other people have done that have had a longer history than us and then implement it back here. Would you say that the technology that we're now using in Australia, and we're going to get to that very shortly, is the exact same as what they're using in America, or have we tailored it to the Australian conditions?
Definitely tailored it. So when it comes to applying what we learn overseas, the concepts are pretty similar. We're all dealing with the same issues, but how the technology we use has to be tailored to our local species. So that good example of that is fishways. So I talked about how we make the best fishways in the world. I sound like Donald Trump. We're fantastic at fishways. We make the best in the world, but we do. And that was because we tailored those to our Australian species. So what does that mean? Well, we know that, salmon are really like the thoroughbreds of fish.
They jump.
They're strong, they jump, Compare that to our species. So while the salmon might be the winks or the chautauqua, our species are more like the bank-honor. Have you heard of bank-honor?
No.
No, you wouldn't have.
But there's plenty of listeners that would have, so...
No, I don't think so. I own bank-honor.
Right.
She was slow, didn't win many races, and cost me a lot of money. But the point I'm trying to make is that our fish are more like the bank-honor than the winks or chautauqua or farlap, okay?
And what you're talking about, though, is attributes there. So salmon are strong, they jump, they can probably navigate certain, structures through pure power and agility, whereas the Murray cod, I compare it to like a sixth-gear tractor. It's slow, it's big, its body isn't streamlined. It's like, you know what I mean? Like they're just not built the same.
Yeah, and that's right. And so what we did with fishways is we adopted fishway designs from the United States. So we, through the late 70s and 80s, we adopted submerged orifice fishways predominantly. The velocities through those slots were just too fast for the Murray cod, and also a lot of our smaller bodied species to move through. So People like Martin Mellencooper and his colleagues really worked hard over the past decades to refine those designs and tailor them for Australian species. We are having to adopt the same process when it comes to screens. So we can't just take it for granted that we can take a screen from the United States and plonk it here in Australian rivers.
Right. So you come back from the States. I think you said 09 to 12. First screen went in 2017, roughly. Let's talk about those years. What had to happen in Australia for us to get that first screen? I can only assume a lot, because you're talking about buy-in from landowners, you're talking about irrigators now not focusing just on, their particular, whatever they seem to be irrigating in. They're now focusing on things like fish, which traditionally probably isn't their number one focus, when they're trying to run a business. You now got to get government bodies on board, and you've got to get the rec fishing. So you got 4 major, groups, bodies or organisations working there. Was it a bit of a struggle?
Yeah, look, I came back from America with a fire in the belly, really. I just thought, this is a solution that could work. And look, as a fish biologist, I thought it made total sense from a fish protection perspective. I came back gung-ho and just thought, this will be easy. We wrote a paper, myself and a couple of colleagues wrote a paper on how we could set up a program here in Australia, a fish screening program. I then, travelled the state, travelled southeastern Australia, talking about how it can happen. And, I had doors slammed in my face. People saw understood the concept, but just sort of even thought it was either too hard or it's not an issue in Australia, or that might work in the United States, but it's not going to work here in Australia. And even colleagues, other researchers were like, "Oh, here's Boise again at another conference,
talking about the same
pissing
thing,
on about fish screens." And it was we weren't getting anywhere. Like, I just felt like we were really spinning the wheels. We tried to sort of come from the top down and go and speak to some of these sort of peak industry bodies, and to be honest, they sort of saw the idea but said, go away, come back when you've got a bit more information about what the issue is, how to solve it.
Did you have the data that you just spoke to me about at that point, the 97 and the 5 mil? Did you have all that at your disposal?
No. So a critical part about it, I think, was there was typically, what I didn't appreciate at the time was there was a lack of awareness that this was an issue.
Yeah.
It wasn't really appreciated, but there was also a lack of understanding that there was a solution out there. So that lack of awareness was something we needed to address. So that's why we went through and went through Trove and found the historical records and accounts of fish losses. It's why we've gone through and we summarised all the contemporary research. So within New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, there's been a lot of researchers over the past decade that have been putting nets in channels, collecting fish, and reporting on them. So there's information in what we call the grey literature, technical government reports, but there's also been some papers published. So there is, that information was out there, but it wasn't consolidated. So what we had to do is bring that all together, and we did that in a paper. But it wasn't enough to just put it in the literature and leave it out there. We had to take it to the road, and we had to, we present to punters. We had to get out there, not only, talking to recreational anglers about it, getting out there and talking to farmers about it. That's a big one. Like standing in cotton fields, standing by the river and having a chat about their experience, understanding what their experience is.
Yeah.
So,
and what is their experience? For the context, yourself, me, Tom. I don't think Tom was there, but we recently went out to Tubbo, right? And we got to chat to an irrigation manager who I think was taking care of 30 odd properties or something like that. And he was saying that he has to back pump twice a day or something along those lines because of the amount of debris that get caught up in the pump. Things like that you just would never. So yeah, can you talk on that a little bit? Because to me that's such a no-brainer.
Yeah, so we probably need to take a step back and talk about how a modern screen, fish protection screen, differs from what's out there right now. Because really, most pumps, gravity-fed diversions, are either unscreened or they actually have what we typically term a trash or debris screen. So those trash or debris screens are really coarse mesh. They actually may be grid bars, and they're designed to keep the largest of items out of the pumps and out of the gravity-fed diversion. So we're talking the logs, the sticks, that huge stuff. What they're not good at is keeping out fish. They're not good at keeping out the smaller debris like leaves, gum nuts, and anything that basically can squeeze through those gaps. So when you look at a traditional screen, the issue with them is that these trash screens is that the mesh is too coarse and the velocity in front of that pump or intake is too high. So when you're looking at the entry to a pipe or those channels, the velocity can be as high as 3 metres per second, and that's just too fast for our fish, particularly our small-bodied and our young fish, eggs and larvae, to swim against. Right. So what a modern fish screen does, it's just it's a much finer mesh. So we're talking about 2 or 3 mils. Some of these screens can, believe it or not, go down to 50 microns, so you can't even see the holes in them. They're that small. But the secret to them is that they're a much larger surface area. So what that does is that just spreads that flow over the entire screen face. So rather than 3 metres a second in front of the intake, that fish are getting drawn in and debris getting drawn in, on a modern screen, you can put your hand on it and you won't feel a suction. So that velocity is dropped down to 0.1 metres a second. And through research that we've done, we've been able to show that that's a good velocity that our fish can basically navigate, negotiate. So fish can move really close to those screens and pass them without getting sucked against them or into the pump. And likewise, we don't get as much debris, those leaves, gum nuts, etc., into the pump. So I suppose coming back then to your question about what some of those irrigators are finding, we hear stories about using old screening technology of guys having to back flush pumps because they'll have as more material gets drawn on those trash racks, pumping efficiency decreases, power usage to run those pumps increases. So they basically have to switch them off and back flush. So every time they stop that pump, they're not delivering water to where it needs to go, but they're also, when they start those pumps up, it can have surge charges in electricity that actually costs them money. So it's costing them money to do that back flushing. It's costing them time. It's we've also, you'll speak to farmers out there that use centre pivots or sprinklers or drip irrigation, and those centre pivots and that drip irrigation clogs. So you can imagine a paddock, those centre pivots where you see those big sprinkler systems that go across.
When you're driving out west, you often see them.
So you'll get, what they report is you get really high pressures and good water delivery close to the pump, but as you move further away, because you get that material, whether it be fish, leaves, gum nuts, blocking those sprinklers, by the time you get to the end of the array, you're getting really low pressures of water. So that impacts on the productivity of crops, so you get less growth out on that part of the paddock. So they have to go around and they have to spend time unplugging sprinklers. We've spoken to guys that have they have inline filters that cost them tens of thousands of dollars that they have to back flush hourly every day in order to protect their drip irrigation lines. That's wasted water and it's wasted time. They can do away with that if they can reduce the amount of debris that comes into their supply from the river.
A lot of the literature seems to be on the benefits for fish, and of course, we've chatted about it, 97 million, of course there's benefits for fish. Just off what you've said there, surely there's a way to position that to be, selling, in inverted commas, to the irrigators to say how many benefits there are for you. You know, like, is that part of your strategy? It wasn't just communicating to the community about the benefits for fish, but communicating the benefits for property owners and irrigators. Like, to me, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah, 100%. Like this, so putting a screen on it's going to be investment, and it needs to. It's
like a solar panel, right?
Yeah, it needs to be a return on investment for the business and for the farmer. So, a lot of farmers are keen fishermen, and they're progressive, and they believe in looking after the environment. So they'll buy in from the fish protection perspective, but they're also running a business. So they need to know that by upgrading their infrastructure, there's something in it for them. So, you know, whether that's reduced maintenance times, whether it's savings on pumps. So that, you know, Tranginevertai irrigation scheme, you mentioned out on the Macquarie River, where they're now operating 4 cone screens, they're reporting $50,000 worth of savings in electricity in a season, just through not having to backflush.
Wow.
You know, we know that they've got greater efficiencies in water delivery, because we've been doing some research out on that, out in their irrigation system. So we wanted to basically look at the benefit of putting a screen on versus not. So how we do that is we remove or bypass the screen at times, and we record the fish that we're catching in the channel, and we put the screen back on. And we were out there for a week, and we'd removed the screen, and Shane Smith, the manager out there at the site, he just started ramping up his pump, and we knew that because our nets were starting to get washed away, our technicians were starting to get washed down the channel, and I'm going, "What are you doing, Shane? Like, how come you turn your pumps up?" And he said, "Hey, because I'm having to keep stopping my pump and back flushing because the screen wasn't on." You know, his pumps were getting clogged. His trash screens that were behind those fish screens were getting clogged, and he had to keep back flushing. So, because he was turning those pumps off, he was getting behind on his water orders. So he had to get back in
and turning them up a little bit.
So he's turning them up and so, guys, when are you guys going to nick off? You know, so I can put my fish screen back on. So, but these are the things though that we're only really getting appreciation for now that we're working with some of these industry leaders, these early adopters that are willing to give this a crack, and now they're sort of realising, I suppose, through having the screen on, all the added benefits.
We talk about that timeline that we mentioned before. We're really in the infancy of this whole story. You know, I get that, you know, you found records back in the 1950s, and I get that you were aware of this and it's been around for a long, long time. But in terms of the Australian story, that trip that you're just speaking about there and that week period of amping up the pumps, that is monumental for the success of this going forward. Because Shane's story could very well be adopted by, you know, the rest of them that are hearing that, and they're going, "Oh, I had no idea of those benefits." And you talk about when you did that big travel around the state and down at the South States, like Victoria, Adelaide, South Australia, you could nearly do another one of them with all the stuff that you've learnt, you know, in the last 2-3 years. Is that right? Like, I feel as though the last 3-4 years has been huge in this story.
So without wanting to bore you or the listeners, I'm going to talk about a concept called diffusion of innovation, because really when you're looking at a modern fish screen, it's a new innovation for Australia. It's a disruption to what we currently do now, to how we currently screen and divert water. So when you've got a new innovation or disruption, the diffusion of innovation is basically a way of describing how one of those innovations will pass through a population. And you know, everyone sits in their ability or their drive to adopt a new innovation on a bell-shaped curve. So you imagine at one tail you've got about 16% of the population that's innovators, early adopters. At the other end of the scale, you've got about 16% of the laggarts. You know, they're never gonna adopt. You know, they're the guys. You know, if you liken screens to iPhones, Teslas, you know, ChatGPT, they're the ones that are, you know, they're still using rotary phones. They're still horse and cart sort of guys. You know. Whereas, you know, the early adopters are those ones that, you know, they were queuing up for the iPhones. They would, you know, they're like my son was using ChatGPT last year before it even came up. You know, they're the people that are on, you know, queues to get Teslas now.
Yes.
The rest of them, around 60, I don't know,
Odd percent,
60 percent, are the majority, and they can be divided up into the early or late. So that majority of people they need to see someone try something first, and that's all within that's within human nature.
Trust,
Like a Tesla. I'm not going to go out and buy a Tesla until I can see that it's, I'm going to get the range on the battery and that the battery's not going to blow up. So I suppose
Can I compare it to a really weird analogy? I'm not going to go get the COVID vaccination until I know, until I know that I'm not going to die from it. That whole
100%.
We've just been through the last 3 years. So it was like there was so much hesitancy around that.
Yep.
The majority of the people, you had people on this end of the scale that were like, I'm never, ever getting that. People on this end of the scale that were like, give me that now.
Yep.
And then the majority were like, well, let's just see what happens,
It's a great analogy. So really when we apply that to fish screens, we don't want to put our effort into those anti-vaxxers.
Yep.
Or the horse and cart or the rotary phone people, because we're never going to sway them. So what we need to do is we need to work with those early adopters. They tend to be those industry leaders, those real progressive farmers. They just they get it now. They get it now. So, and there's plenty of them out there, So what we need to do is get screens into their hands. This is where we start to be able to demonstrate not only the benefits for fish, but the benefits for farms. They help us sell that concept to the majority. So in the United States, they have a saying, no one sells a screen like a farmer with a screen. And it's basically the same. That's diffusion of innovation in practice. It's social learning in practice. And it's been a really important, I suppose, realisation for us in how we can start making inroads into that 4,500 pumps in New South Wales alone. All those, those hundreds of gravity-fed diversions. We need to just start making those initial steps. And it's, I talked about us spinning our wheels, sort of trying to come top down. Well, with this realisation of this sort of diffusion of innovation theory, we said, well, let's come bottom up. Let's get some of these screens into the hands of farmers that are already telling us they're dealing with issues in their supply line, debris, unpicking sprinklers, So
yeah, it's a great. I've never thought of it like that, and clearly that's something that you and your team have identified early. But I think that doesn't just apply to fish screens. I think there's plenty of issues in our waterways that whole concept applies to, like the removal of weirs and cold water pollution and the different ways we try to implement around that, even though some of them haven't been overly successful, but we're still working on that. I think it's a fantastic way to put it, and I hope everyone at home kind of understands that bell curve. I know we're on a podcast and you can't really see it, but that big spike in the middle is where you're really trying to target. You mentioned there just quickly cone screens versus the other screens. I can only assume there's more than one type. I've seen them. They do the same job, but they are structured a little bit differently. Just run us through where you would put one and the other and why you've come up with a few different designs, or not necessarily yourself, but the team.
Yeah, so there's a saying we have, and it's horses for courses and screens for streams. Basically, what that means is...
Did you come up with that?
I probably did. I don't know. Might have been Tom. He's good at that sort of thing. Effectively what it means is screens can come in all shapes and sizes, and they need to be. They need to be designed specifically for the needs of that system. So, a cone screen, for instance, is actually really good in shallow water environments. It can operate, partly submersed or fully submersed. There's cylinder screens. So that the benefit of a cylinder is that you can just fit a large surface area screen in a smaller area.
Yeah.
There's also things like flat panel screens. There's rotating treadmill type designs. So they do come in all shapes and sizes, and they're suitable for different installations in some cases and not others. But the principle of them all remains the same, and that is that they need to be designed so that they're approach velocity, so the velocity in front of that intake doesn't exceed 0.1 metres a second.
That's the number.
Yep.
That's
and some of the better designs then incorporate things like self-cleaning. So they might have brushes, airburst systems, jets that just help keep that screen face clean, so that we get that uninterrupted delivery of water. So yeah, and because of that, what we've done as an important part of, like you mentioned earlier, about tailoring these screens to Australian conditions, we had to do about 10 years worth of research in flumes, in rivers, to try understand, what is that approach velocity that we need to set for Australian species? What is that mesh size that we need for Australian species?
And it could be slightly different in other countries.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
So look, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So, there's been great work, long history of screening in other parts of the world. So, we've adopted some of where we're data deficient. We've adopted what they've learnt over there, but we've made sure that we've been able to prove these up for our fish as well. So that's been a huge part about giving water users the confidence, giving water authorities and fisheries managers the confidence that these are actually pretty good investments of public money.
Yeah, there's a bit of thought behind it too. It's not just a matter of, hey, let's put a screen on. It's like, let's get the right screen for your particular, area. 4,500 screens. Is that the number we're running with?
4,500 pumps unscreened.
4,500 pumps unscreened.
In New South Wales alone. So we've got good data in New South Wales, and I work for in New South Wales, so that's been my focus. We're pretty data deficient, when we look at some of the other states, but, the same issue in Queensland, Victoria, South Australia.
How many screens can we... How many pumps can we screen in the next 5 years, realistically? So
the point I will make is that every screen we put in is already, from the day it goes in, is saving hundreds of fish. So every screen that goes in makes a difference. Look, we're running a couple of big programs in New South Wales at the present time. We've got on the Macquarie River, we've got an ambitious target of getting close to about 70% of the diverted water coming out of Burrendong Dam being screened. And we believe we'll get to that over in the next couple of years. From that, we believe that we'll be saving 3 million native fish per year just through that program alone. I'll correct myself, 1 million from that program alone. We've also got another program on the Northern Basin Toolkit that's been funded from the Australian government that's looking at dealing with priority sites through the Barwon, Darling and Mihai rivers. Together, those two programs in the north, we believe that we'll be saving 3 million native fish per year. But these programs are oversubscribed. So we've actually got more interest currently than we've got funding in our programs to help subsidise. So if we were able to realise even those extra pipeline projects, we're talking about 5 million.
Yeah, which is what the stocking rate is in Australia. So if you think about it, obviously those same fish that have been stocked are not the exact same ones that get sucked, but you're starting to... Now the stocking's going to have a better chance, you know what I mean?
And stocking is something that you need to continually do. You need to do year in, year out, and keep doing. Whereas a screen, you put it in, you walk away, and it's having those savings every year. Those fish are staying in the river where they can breed, where they can bolster future populations.
I think we're in a real kind of... You'll put a flag up in this point in the timeline, I reckon, if we had this same conversation in 10 years' time. Let's hope OzCast is still running in 10 years' time and we sit and have a chat. I reckon around this period is where you'll go, that's where the real change came from people starting to understand the issue, from people starting to buy in, and now you're starting to get pumps screened, which is fantastic. Are you optimistic about the future, particularly in this industry?
Look, I am. I think, look, we've engineered our way into a lot of problems in rivers, but we can equally engineer our way out of it.
Yeah.
The challenge we have is not in being able to demonstrate the logic or the benefits that can come from doing something like screening. I think, it won't be too long before we've got, broad acceptance of the fact that this is a new best practice for how we should be diverting water. The challenge is really going to come from how do we address the issue? Where are we going to get the money from to address the issue? Who's going to pay? These are the conversations and the challenges we need to grapple with. I think, on that, we have spent a huge amount of money to put in the infrastructure that's got us where we're at now, with respect to weirs, dams, pumps, etc. It would only cost a fraction of what we've spent to date to actually improve their design, to modernise it and fix it. It's just there needs to be a will there to spend the money. And I was listening to your chat with Mark Lintemans the other day, and blew me away when he was talking about that.
Submarines?
Yeah, submarines. What, 36 million in a day for the next 30 years.
So 300 million or something ridiculous.
Yeah, that's right. So there is apparently money there to spend on things. I suppose, need to direct that to where it needs to go. And it's there's a guy called Boyd Blackwell at New South Wales Fisheries that's been doing some interesting research on people's motivations to pay or preparedness to pay for things when it comes into the habitat restoration area. And so what I've seen some of Boyd's preliminary research, and what it has shown, it doesn't matter if you live on the coast or you live in the bush, doesn't matter if you vote Labor, Liberal, Teal, Green.
Yep.
Everyone is prepared to invest money to see outcomes in native fish recovery. And in fact, they're prepared to pay more than we're actually investing. So that preparedness to pay is there. We just need to be able to, I suppose, set up the programs, convince the policymakers that these are good enough ideas, that they're going to get a significant enough return on investment from the public purse to invest in.
Do we have the understanding, the research, the technology and the innovation, I guess, if that money decides to come in, let's say people just start paying, can we take that money and get cracking straight away? Like, are we at that point now where it's just money that we need?
Yeah. Well, look, we're doing it now. I think there's plenty more that we need to be doing to make these screening programs more sustainable. Yeah. So currently they are, a screen can cost anywhere from, I've seen ones go in for $10,000, $20,000 to projects that are many millions of dollars. Addressing some of our biggest diversion points that are having probably the biggest impact on our native fish isn't going to come cheap. A big part of making these programs sustainable is trying to look at how we can innovate in screen technologies to bring the costs down, to make it more affordable for private users to invest. We're not going to be able to subsidise screens from the public purse forever, So we need to make sure that we're continuing to innovate to bring the costs of these down without compromising their ability to protect fish and to provide clean water for farms as well. That's an important trade-off.
If anyone was trying to pick up on the analogy that you spoke, you can head back to the previous episode with Mark Lintemans, and he was speaking about the costs that Australia is investing in defence and submarines, and he broke that down and basically outlined that we're spending 30 odd million a day or something like that. No, what was it?
36 million a day.
Yeah, 36 for 30 years.
Next 30 years, yeah.
So go have a listen to that if you want to hear a little bit about how, this money conversation and how maybe where attention is spent elsewhere. Look, Craig, it's been a fantastic chat. I think we've dived into some of the major ones there, not just the issue, but then how we've got to this, your learning experiences in other countries like the United States, all the way through to what screens we have here in Australia. I think come back to that idea of this issue being slept on, I think it is. I think hopefully podcasts like this and your talks raise the issue for, the masses of people to understand that if we get the money, we've now got the technology and the people in place and the programs in place to do something about it. And that's obviously been seen in the Macquarie. And in terms of this timeline, we're at a really kind of neat spot with turning this story on its head from something that had no momentum, get doors shut in your face, people not wanting to listen, to now people starting to go, oh, right.
Yeah, and look, and it's encouraging also to see that, there's like, you look at the native fish recovery strategy that the Commonwealth put out, now has screening as a key action on that. The 50-year New South Wales water strategy recognises that screening, along with coal water pollution and fishways, needs to be a key action to improve our rivers. So, that's been really important to get that recognition, and hopefully the rest will start falling into place.
Very good. Hey, I just want to leave us here. You said there was, I think we were speaking off air, maybe out in Dubbo, and you said there was a book that below the surface, our tagline here at OzCast, that reminded you of a book or a movie or something like that. What was that? Just to give our listeners a bit of a recommendation.
Yeah, so that's For the Love of Rivers.
For the Love of Rivers.
Kirk Fausch. If I wouldn't expect many of the listeners to know Kirk, but as a fish ecologist, fish biologist, many of them would know Kirk. So he worked for decades in the United States and over in Japan as a river ecologist. Look, the opening passage to Kirk's book really sort of highlights some of what I suppose we were speaking to at the introduction to this, just how it's an unseen world below the surface, and it's our responsibility as researchers to be educators, to take people into that world, because there's a lot of beauty and there's great things to see, but there's also a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, 1,000 cuts, and until we can bring people into that world and help translate some of that to the wider audience, we can't start taking those steps to recover our native fish populations.
There you go. If I assume you can still get it, just
you
a Google.
For the Love of Rivers.
For the Love of Rivers. Very good. We're going to leave it there. It's an hour and 8. I know you've got a sore back and it's probably seized up by now, but thanks so much for joining OzCast. That's Craig Boyes talking on fish screens. This episode of OzCast has been proudly supported by the One Basin CRC and BCF. Boating, camping, fishing. For more information on fish screens, head over to the Fish Screens Australia website. This website will keep you up to date on all the latest news and developments in the project across the country. You can find that at fishscreens.org.au.